President Trump delivered a bold message at the UN. It's a bit of an annual tradition. He laid out the frightening state of religious freedom around the world and called on all nations to do more to protect persons of faith. As an Arab Christian, whose own family knew real religious persecution within this past century, I'm especially grateful to be part of what the entire Trump administration is doing to protect religious minorities around the world. Unfortunately, in international circles, not only have threats to religious freedom often been ignored, but the sacred importance of the family and the right to life are often disrespected too. As somebody who's now represented the United States on health matters around the world for almost 2 decades, I can tell you, it's discouraging and disheartening to see how international organizations and wealthy nations can bully countries on matters of fundamental importance like the sacred role of the family and the right to life. So earlier this year, Secretary Pompeo and I publicly called upon the world's nations to stand up against this kind of anti-life advocacy. We did so in the lead-up to a major meeting at the UN General Assembly, where we anticipated an effort to suggest that all nations ought to view abortion as a necessary element of health care, and to claim that abortion is a fundamental human right. The eventual declaration from that meeting included terms that, without caveats, can and have been used to bully lower-income nations regarding their policies on issues like abortion. So, did any of you happen to hear what we ended up doing at the UN in response? Anyone? Following President Trump's lead, we gathered a coalition of 21 nations representing more than 1.3 billion people and 4 of the 10 largest nations on Earth. We took a stand. We delivered a clear message. Each nation has a sovereign right to protect the lives of its own citizens and protect the role of the family within their own borders. We made it unequivocally clear. Under President Trump, the United States will never tolerate language that implies there is an international right to abortion. We will boldly proclaim that there is no such right. We will hold UN agencies accountable when they drift into such advocacy, and we will continue to protect life around the world. We work closely with Secretary Pompeo to implement President Trump's restored and expanded Mexico City policy, one of the president's first actions when he took office. Under that policy, protecting life and global health assistance, we've worked to ensure that HHS's global health assistance is not provided to foreign non-governmental organizations that provide or promote abortion as a method of family planning. Mexico City policy has always attracted all kinds of criticism, with claims about how it would imperil the overseas. Yet when we implemented the expanded version of the policy, HHS only saw one grantee drop out of our programs, and we were able to find another to fill the gap without any interruption in services whatsoever. Another area where this administration has fought for life is our scientific work. We've ensured that the life-saving scientific research that we support is not done in a way that disrespects life. This administration is proud to recognize that, as all of you well know, you can be pro-life and pro-science at the same time. One of the exciting signs of that commitment is the President's success in passing Right to Try. Every year of life, every month or day for someone struggling with a terminal illness is precious. The President recognizes that, which is why he fought for and signed legislation that will open up more opportunities for patients who are diagnosed with life-threatening diseases to access new experimental treatment options. That's just one more sign of a president who is intent on building a culture of life, dignity, and hope. We've also been vigorous in ensuring that taxpayer funding is not going to support abortion. This year, HHS began implementing a rule that enforces statutory requirements under Title X by no longer permitting family planning services funded with your taxpayer dollars from occurring at the same location where abortion is provided. Unbelievably, many abortion-providing recipients chose to pull out of the program and stop delivering health care to women in need. The new Title X regulation also protects women and children who have been victims of abuse, molestation, trafficking, and a number of other crimes, which complies with the requirement passed by Congress that the previous administration. We rescinded an Obama administration guidance that prevented states from taking actions against providers that may be necessary to prevent Medicaid funds from going to fund abortion. We're also protecting your own health care dollars from going to services that would violate your conscience. Last year, we issued guidance to allow people to claim a hardship exemption from the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate if all ACA plans offered in your area include abortion coverage contrary to your beliefs. One of the unshakable commitments of HHS in our civil rights and non-discrimination is to ensure that every American is treated with dignity and is not discriminated against in our programs because he or she is a member of a statutorily protected class. All individuals should be treated with dignity and respect in healthcare. But all Americans who participate in or benefit from our programs must be free from discrimination not just based on protected classes, but the dictates of their conscience and the ways they live out their faith. Neither form of discrimination will be tolerated under this administration. In fact, we've institutionalized that commitment. In 2018, under the leadership of Roger Severino here in the front row, we announced the establishment of the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division in our Office for Civil Rights. We begin proper federal enforcement of existing laws that protect our first freedom. This year, we finalized a new comprehensive conscience regulation which protects the conscience and non-discrimination rights of patients and healthcare providers by fully and robustly enforcing approximately 25 provisions passed by Congress. Now, all we're doing is providing ways to enforce the laws that are on the books, typically passed with strong bipartisan support by the people's representatives in Congress. But if you listen to critics of our regulation, you'd imagine we wrote some wholly new sets of laws or policies. Yet literally all we're doing is providing robust enforcement for the laws that Congress has actually passed. Our regulation provides the same kind of enforcement powers for these laws that we've already accrued to other civil rights protections. We've done the enforcement work to back this up too. Under Roger's leadership, we recently issued a notice of violation to a major hospital after finding that the hospital violated conscience laws by requiring a nurse to assist in an abortion. Forcing medical staff to assist in the taking of human life is wrong, plain and simple. And under President Trump, we will not tolerate it. We also took major actions against Hawaii and California to protect the conscience rights of pro-life pregnancy centers. When state laws coerced these centers into posting notices that referred women to abortion providers, we issued an unprecedented notice of violation under what are known as the Weldon and Coates-Snow Amendments. As a result of that action, Hawaii signed an agreement with the Trump administration not to enforce its own discriminatory statement. And under the great leadership of Shannon Royce, we've also protected the freedom of faith-based organizations that work for the vulnerable in human services by reducing barriers for faith-based providers who care for the elderly and disabled and provide foster and adoption services. For instance, we issued South Carolina a waiver that ensures faith-based organizations can continue to serve children in foster care. We determined that these organizations would have otherwise faced unacceptable burdens to their religious beliefs. We certainly don't want to put up barriers to Americans living out their beliefs, providing important care to a vulnerable, needy population. Now, many of you are quite familiar with one of the most prominent conscience fights in recent memory, the contraception mandate under the Affordable Care Act. The mandate required employer-sponsored insurance to cover some types of contraception that some religious groups and organizations found objectionable on religious or moral grounds. This included all kinds of organizations, but most poignantly, many that care for the least among us, like the Little Sisters of the Poor, a religious order that cares for elderly Americans of limited means. As many of you know, the Little Sisters of the Poor and other groups fell under the scope of this regulation because the previous administration's so-called accommodation for religious organizations was so narrow. In fact, I've heard it joked that Jesus' own ministry might have had a hard time qualifying as a religious organization by something as strict as that originally promulgated definition. You could almost imagine the scrutiny. Just 12 guys? They only fed the 5,000 once? That an organized religious concern over the regulations? Hard to say. Well, the Trump administration recognized that the Little Sisters of the Poor and so many other religious organizations and private citizens with religious or conscience objections had a right to live out their faiths through service. We stood beside the Little Sisters of the Poor and many other groups, provided them with the exemptions they deserve. If you want to live out your faith and serve your fellow Americans, we will not make you violate your rights to do so. Finally, I want to mention that we've gone beyond just protecting the rights of religious Americans. Through Shannon's Center for Faith and Opportunity Initiatives, the Partnership Center, we've assisted communities of faith and faith-based providers in confronting many pressing health challenges. We've been especially proud to see faith communities work to expand access to treatment for Americans struggling with. What I've laid out for you today are many of the ways that under President Trump, HHS has protected life, conscience, faith. A whole lot going on. But when I think about the very core of our mission and why I'm so proud, it's pretty simple. The department I get to run is really the Department of Life. I'm so proud to say that has never been more true than it is today. HHS and its team have never fought more fiercely to protect life at all stages. That is thanks above all to the work, the leadership, and the courage of President Trump. I'm grateful for the chance to lead that work and to share it with you all today. You're here because you cherish life. You all innately know that every human being, as the Psalms put it, is fearfully and wonderfully made. This means that each person, whether unborn, young, old, or somewhere in between, has innate dignity. At HHS and under President Trump, we respect that truth, and we will continue to fight for it. That truth undergirds our mission and informs our work every day at the department. As you go about your work, protecting life, strengthening your own communities, and caring for your families and your country, may God bless you, and may God continue to bless the United States of America.
Ladies and gentlemen, coming now is a true pioneer of our values voter movement as a leading spokesman for pro-life, pro-family, and pro-growth values. He was Chief Domestic Policy Advisor to President Ronald Reagan, Senior Vice President of Focus on the Family, and President of the Family Research Council, and in the year 2000, he ran for President of the United States. Today, he serves as Chairman of Campaign for Working Families PAC, dedicated to electing conservative candidates to Congress, as President of American Values, featuring his end-of-day email briefing, which is a must-read for all values voters. And he's also part of the same commission that Tony serves on, one of the commissioners of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Gary Bauer.
President Reagan, who Gil mentioned, told me once that if I ever give a speech and the audience gives me a standing ovation when I'm introduced, I ought to sit down because I have nowhere to go but down after that. I'm proceeding at my own risk here. You are a great sight in Washington, D.C. We're living at a crazy, crazy time. And I got to tell you, my friends, when you listened, if you did last night, to the president in Minneapolis, and when you saw what was going on in the streets outside of that hall that he spoke at, this is exactly the right man. While we're here, the president is meeting with Premier Xi of China, trying to work out some kind of a trade deal. We'll see how it goes. So let's talk a little bit about China and about the United States. Just a few weeks ago, China celebrated, quote unquote, the 70th anniversary on October 3rd. It was their national day, the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. Some of the American media kind of misdescribed it. They said it was the 70th anniversary of China. No, and China's a little older than that. 70th anniversary of the Communist Party of China taking over China. That's what it was. And it's hardly something to be celebrated. In fact, it's worth taking a look about what China did in the weeks and months leading up to October 1st. The Chinese government told all the Chinese television stations to take off the air during the day all the regular shows, all the regular programming for 60 days leading up to October 1st. And during those 60 days, all the programming was replaced with patriotic programming, historical dramas, uplifting China, patriotic speeches. There was a steady diet of this for 60 days. And then on October 1st, a carefully selected crowd was put in the streets of China. And as they waited in the streets for the big celebratory parade to start, you could hear the parade before you saw it. Because marching through the streets of Beijing into Tiananmen Square were tens of thousands of Chinese troops goose-stepping, reminiscent of Hitler's army in the 1930s. It was a complete militarized event. And it wasn't just the tens of thousands of soldiers. There were all kinds of weapons in the parade. And not just any weapon. Weapons that, according to the press accounts, U.S. intelligence didn't know anything about. And that was a little disturbing. There was a supersonic missile that could travel 5 times the speed of sound. A new intercontinental ballistic missile that could hit any city in the United States. Underwater drones that have been weaponized to be used against, well, guess whose navy? So when I read the articles about the surprise of our intelligence forces about all this, the thought crossed my mind. The last 10 years before Donald Trump, what were they busy doing? Oh, I remember some of them were busy interfering in America's political system instead of doing their job to protect the United States of America from our foreign enemies. So these are the things that happened in China on October 1st. One military analyst who works at the Pentagon, didn't want to be named, said it was clear after watching that parade that the military edge the United States has had for any potential adversary in the world since the end of World War II was in fact gone. Now, what happened in the days leading up to October 1st wasn't something new in China. Every corner of Chinese life is telling their citizens, telling their young people, that the future belongs to China, that they are part of a great nation, that there will be nothing that will stand in the way of the Chinese people. Even Chairman Mao, the guy who wrote the Little Red Book, more infamously known as the man that is literally responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people in China as communism strengthened its grip on the nation. Even he's enjoying a facelift. He's being held back up as an example of what Chinese leadership can really be. That ought to disturb all of us. So think about this, ladies and gentlemen. In China, with their history, with all the things that they have done, with all of the acts of intolerance they are responsible for, of all the people that are rotting in their prisons, they have the confidence to teach their young people that the future belongs to them because they are part of an incredible country that nobody can stop. And what's going on at the same time here in the United States? A country that has promoted more liberty and more freedom for more people than any country in the history of the world. In the United States, in our schools, teachers at every level, beginning in elementary school to high school, all the way up to the universities, are teaching our children that America is an evil country and it was evil at its very birth. How can you explain that? You and I know of the greatness of America. I remember growing up and reading about the founders. Any one of them would have been an incredible blessing for a group of people like early Americans trying to start a new nation, defeat the greatest power in the world at the time. But it wasn't just one. It wasn't just George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. There were dozens of men, any one of whom could have defined the age they were living in. I always took that as evidence that God's hands of blessing were on this nation at the very beginning. These were unbelievable intellects, men that understood that liberty doesn't come from government, that it comes from God. They believed that our liberty came from God. They told the citizens of the new nation that we're all made in the image of God. And because we're made in His image, this nation has always stood for the idea that it doesn't matter whether you're a newborn with Down syndrome, a 90-year-old with senility, it doesn't matter what your race is, you have dignity and value and worth. Your children and grandchildren, other and very isolated cases, are not being taught that. The history books being used in American schools are disgusting. They're not being taught about the founders, and if they are, they're being taught the wrong information. They're not being taught about what went on at Valley Forge or Concord Bridge or what the debates were about in Independence Hall. The fact that they're being taught about anything about the founders, they're being taught to hate them. In fact, if you had to sum it up, they're basically being taught that the founders, for lack of a better phrase, are irredeemable and deplorable. Literally, they're being taught that the founders were white supremacists. Now, I know right-wing watch is here, somewhere in the back of the room. They always come to the Values Voters Summit, and they selectively take quotes out of various people's speeches, and then they put them up on their website to condemn what was said. So just so I'm clear about this, whoever back there works for right-wing watch, I am not advocating that our schools should become little propaganda ministries teaching a whitewashed version of American history. That's not what I'm advocating. But what I am advocating is that our schools should not be helping America's enemies by teaching anti-American history. Now, here's what they hang their hat on, this anti-American history. The founders, like Thomas Jefferson, owned slaves. That's a terrible thing. One man owning another man is an abomination. It's not only about offense against the moral law, it's an offense against the natural law. By the way, it was Western civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization, that established the values that meant that slavery would end. So Thomas Jefferson had slaves. That's a terrible thing. But because he was involved in that terrible thing, they can't give him credit for writing the Declaration of Independence or the second paragraph of that declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Those words brought the end of slavery eventually. Throughout history, virtually every continent, every tribe, every people, every nation has somewhere in their history slavery. It is a sad fact of the human condition. Then the founding fathers who created this great nation with God's blessings, and to not teach our children what this great nation has done to bring liberty around the world is not only malpractice, it is an intentional effort to destroy the natural love any human being has for the place of their birth. This is a scandal, and it's got to be addressed. When Abraham Lincoln made the argument in the Lincoln-Douglas debates against slavery, he didn't attack the Founding Fathers. He embraced the Founding Fathers. He pointed to the founding documents. Lincoln said, no man's been born with a saddle on his back. Another man's born with spurs to riding. He argued to the country that to fulfill the promises of our founding documents, slavery had to be eliminated. When Martin Luther King Jr. led the civil rights movement, he didn't attack America's founding. He didn't tell Black Americans that America was evil. He didn't stand at the Lincoln Memorial and condemn Jefferson and Washington. He quoted from the Declaration of Independence. He told the country, we're not anti-America. We want to be fully Americans. We want to be covered by the promises in those founding documents. And it's not only the founding fathers. Our symbols are trashed. Our flag is burned. Leftist social justice warriors take a knee when the national anthem is being played. And by the way, I know you notice when these things happen, Donald Trump, with everything he's got on his plate, takes on those leftist media, goes crazy. What's he doing attacking NFL football players? There are even Republicans who will say to him, sometimes privately, sometimes publicly, Mr. President, why are you getting into that? Why are you getting in an argument with some football player? Keep focused on the agenda. That is the agenda. Thank you. The agenda. Lowering taxes, lowering capital gains taxes, deregulating business, rebuilding our military. Those are all wonderful things. We need to do all of those things. The president is doing those things. But none of those things will matter if our youth come to believe that America is not worth their love, devotion, and sacrifice. More and more schools have dropped the Pledge of Allegiance. When I was in school, we began the day with a prayer, non-denominational prayer, and the Pledge of Allegiance. A non-denominational prayer does not make somebody a believer, and a Pledge of Allegiance does not make somebody a patriot. But what it does do is tell young children that the adults in their lives believe that loving your country and seeking God are noble and decent things that they ought to think about, strive to do. A normal country would want their children to believe that. So the pledge, prayer's gone, the court decision saying you can't make kids stand up for the pledge if they've got religious or other objections. Then schools started saying, so many kids aren't standing up anymore. Maybe we should stop the pledge in the 5th or 6th grade. And now there are a lot of schools that don't even start the day with it. Often parents are clueless that that is the case. So what happens when you have an educational system that undermines your history, teaches your children that America was built and conceived in evil, slavery, genocide, all the rest of it? Well, those kids go through school, and then they go out in America, and they run the corporations, and they go into the media, all the jobs that adults take. And the research shows the rising generation coming out of our schools is the least patriotic generation in the history of America. That is a big deal, my friends, because we're living in an increasingly dangerous world.